In the year 1615, a fleet of pirates threatened to sack Lima, and the entire city trembled with fear. Meanwhile, a frail young woman, worn down by penance, ran to the church, ready to defend Christ's altar with her own life. Who was this girl, capable of facing an army of plunderers with nothing but prayer? She was Rose of Lima, the first flower of holiness to bloom in the New World. Join us as we discover her astonishing life, filled with love, miracles, and tenderness, and learn why the Church venerates this humble young woman from Lima as the first saint of the Americas. Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city or country you are joining us from today. We are delighted to know how far devotion to Saint Rose reaches. And if you carry an intention in your heart, leave it in the comments as your prayer request as well. It will be like the letters that the faithful still cast into Saint Rose's well in Lima, entrusting their wishes to her. Let us pray together, placing every intention under her protection. If this story strengthens your faith, stay with us until the end. Chapter 1. Who was Saint Rose of Lima? Saint Rose of Lima holds a unique place in the history of the Church. She was the first person born on the American continent to be raised to the altars, the first saint of the Americas. That is why she has been called the first flower of holiness in the New World, a flower that blossomed in lands that had received the gospel barely a century earlier. Her figure is a source of pride and devotion for an entire continent. She lived in Lima, the capital of the then viceroyalty of Peru, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. And in that city, amid a simple and hidden life, she reached the highest heights of holiness through a path of love for Christ, penance, and charity toward the poor. She was neither a queen nor a founder nor a doctor of the Church. She was a humble laywoman, and it is precisely in that simplicity that the greatness of her example lies. Her life is surrounded by astonishing episodes and endearing stories that popular devotion has lovingly preserved. It is said that she made a pact with the mosquitoes in her garden, that she helped save Lima from the pirates through her prayers, and that she threw the key to her penance into a well, so she would never remove it. Behind these stories was a soul wholly devoted to God and to her brothers and sisters. She was a Dominican tertiary, that is, a consecrated laywoman belonging to the great family of Saint Dominic, and she took Saint Catherine of Siena as her model, striving to imitate her life. Like her, she joined an intense life of prayer and penance with a fervent love for the poor and the sick, whom she cared for in her own home. Her holiness thus blossomed in everyday life, in work, service, and prayer. The Church canonized her only a few decades after her death and proclaimed her patroness of Peru, the Americas, the Philippines, and many other lands. Her feast is celebrated on August 23rd, and her name is venerated throughout the continent and beyond. Saint Rose of Lima is living proof that holiness can blossom in any land and in any circumstance. To get to know this great saint, let us begin at the beginning, with the city and family that witnessed her birth, and with the beautiful name she would bear forever. For Rose was not given that name at birth, and the story of her name already foreshadowed the beauty of her soul. Let us see. Chapter 2. Lima, 1586, the girl called Rose. Rose was born in Lima on April 20th, 1586, into a large family of modest means. At her baptism, she was given the name Isabel, but very soon people began calling her Rose. Tradition tells us that it was her nurse, an indigenous woman, who gave her this nickname after seeing the beauty of the little girl's face, lovely as a rose. That affectionate nickname would eventually become her true name. In time, that name was solemnly confirmed. While she was still a child, Rose received the sacrament of confirmation from the hands of the Holy Archbishop of Lima, Turribius of Mogrovejo, himself now venerated as a saint, during a pastoral visit. And, according to the custom of the time, at her confirmation she officially received the name Rose, to which she would later add of St. Mary, out of her love for the Virgin. Thus the one who had been Isabel became forever Rose of St. Mary. From a very young age, Rose showed extraordinary piety and an inclination toward the things of God that amazed everyone who knew her. She loved prayer, withdrew into silence, and felt a special tenderness for Jesus and the Virgin Mary. While other girls played, she sought out secluded places to pray, and from childhood her heart was already directed toward total self-giving to God. Rose's family experienced financial difficulties, and from a young age the girl helped support them through the work of her hands. Far from embittering her, those hardships made her hard-working, humble, and compassionate toward those who suffered. She soon learned the value of work and sacrifice, and to share what little she had with the poorest. Poverty was, for her, a school of virtue. Her beauty, which had earned her the name Rose, soon became a source of concern for her. For as she grew, that beauty attracted attention and the advances of potential suitors, as well as her family's plans to marry her advantageously. But Rose had another plan in her heart, very different from what the world offered her. For deep in her soul, Rose had resolved to belong to Christ alone. From childhood, she felt called to consecrate herself entirely to God, and that desire grew stronger with the years. This decision, made out of love for the Lord, would shape her entire life and more than once place her at odds with her family's plans. Let us see how her love for Christ matured in her from childhood. Chapter 3. Love for Christ from childhood. From a very early age, Rose felt in her heart an ardent love for Jesus Christ, which became the guiding thread of her entire life. While still very young, she decided to consecrate her virginity to God, promising to belong to Him alone and never to marry. She chose Christ as the one spouse of her soul, and she remained faithful to that promise until death with an admirable firmness for such a simple young woman. That decision was not easy, for it conflicted with her family's wishes. Her parents, as was natural in their time, planned to marry her and introduced her to potential suitors. But Rose remained firm in her resolve to belong to Christ alone. Tradition holds that in order to discourage her suitors and protect her consecration, she went so far as to deliberately disfigure the beauty that was so greatly praised, preferring to displease men rather than be unfaithful to her divine spouse. On her spiritual journey, Rose found a model and guide in St. Catherine of Siena, the great Dominican tertiary of the 14th century. When she learned of Catherine's life, she wanted to imitate her in everything, in love for Christ, in penance, in charity, and in devotion to God. Catherine was like an older sister and teacher to her, whose example urged her to climb ever higher in the love of the Lord. In St. Catherine of Siena, Rose found not only a model, but almost a sister of the soul. Like Catherine, she was a Dominican tertiary. Like her, she united the most rigorous penance with a passionate love for Christ and the Church, and like her, she ardently desired the salvation of souls. The young woman of Lima sought to reproduce in the New World the holiness of that great saint of Italy, and she did so in such a way that she has rightly been called a new Catherine. Following that path, Rose entered the Third Order of St. Dominic, that is, the lay branch of the Dominican family, which allowed lay people to live the spirit of the order without entering a convent. She donned the habit of the Dominican tertiaries and devoted herself entirely to a life of prayer, penance, and charity, remaining at home with her family, but wholly consecrated to God. As a tertiary, Rose lived the Dominican ideal of combining contemplation and charity, seeking God in prayer and serving Him in others. Her life unfolded between prayer and work, between intimate communion with Christ and caring for the poor and the sick. She did not need to leave her home or her city to become a saint. She was sanctified in the ordinary circumstances of life, right where God had placed her. At the heart of that life was love for Christ crucified. Rose contemplated the Lord's passion deeply and burned with the desire to unite herself to His sufferings out of love and for the salvation of souls. That love for the cross gave rise to one of the most striking features of her life, her rigorous penance. It should be contemplated with respect and sobriety so that we may understand the love that moved her. Chapter 4. The Penitent in Love with the Cross. One of the features that most impresses us in the life of Saint Rose is her rigorous penance. Moved by love for Christ crucified and by the desire to make reparation for sins and save souls, Rose imposed upon herself fasts, vigils, and severe mortifications, characteristic of her time and of her particular vocation. She wanted, so to speak, to accompany the Lord in his passion, also carrying a share of the cross. This should be contemplated with sobriety and through the eyes of faith, without stopping at what is merely outward. What matters is not the severity of the penances in themselves, but the immense love that moved her. Rose did not mortify herself out of contempt for life or because she sought suffering, but out of love to unite herself to Christ, to make reparation for sinners, and to master within herself whatever might turn her heart away from God. Behind every penance was an act of love. In presenting Saint Rose to us, the Church does not ask us to imitate the harshness of her austerities, which belonged to her time, but the love and self-giving that inspired them. Indeed, even during her own lifetime, her confessors and her mother sometimes moderated her penances, watching over her prudence and obedience. For true Christian penance does not consist in rigor for rigor's sake, but in the love that denies itself in order to belong more fully to God. In Rose, the Lord's words were fulfilled in a heroic way. "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross every day, and follow me." Luke 9:23. She took up her cross out of love and embraced it joyfully, knowing that the way of the cross is the path that leads to glory. Her penance was the expression of a love that held nothing back. These famous words of hers sum up the meaning of her entire life. "Apart from the cross, there is no other ladder by which to ascend to heaven." In these words lies the key to her penance and her holiness. Rose understood that there is no love without sacrifice, no glory without the cross, and no resurrection without death. And she wished to ascend to heaven by the only ladder that leads there, the cross of Christ, embraced out of love. But Rose's penance did not enclose her within herself, rather it opened her to others. That love for the cross expressed itself in a fervent love for the poor and the sick, in whom she saw and served Christ himself. Her life was not only one of prayer and penance, but also of work and charity. Let us now consider this other side of Saint Rose, the woman who worked and served the poorest. Chapter 5. Work and Charity, Flowers, Needlework, and the Poor. Saint Rose did not turn her back on the world or live in idleness. Rather, she worked with her hands to support her family and help the poor. Since the family was experiencing financial hardship, Rose contributed to their livelihood by growing flowers in the garden of their home, which she later sold, and by doing exquisite sewing and embroidery. With the proceeds of that humble work, she helped her family and those in need. Those flowers and embroideries made by her hands have something symbolic about them. For Rose, who bore the name of a flower, grew flowers to feed the poor and transformed her work into an act of love and charity. She despised nothing. She used everything as an opportunity to do good. In small, everyday things, a flower, a piece of needlework, she placed great love, and in this way she sanctified the work of each day. But her charity did not stop at giving alms. Rose welcomed the poor, the sick, and the elderly into her own home and cared for them with her own hands, with admirable tenderness and devotion. She set aside a corner of the house to care for those who were suffering, and there she fed them, treated them, and comforted them. In a sense, she was a forerunner of organized works of mercy, a pioneer in caring for the most needy in her homeland. And her charity made no distinctions. In a society marked by divisions, Rose welcomed and served everyone: indigenous people, the poor, abandoned sick people, and enslaved people, seeing in each one of them, without distinction, the face of Christ. To her, all were children of God and her brothers and sisters, and she loved them all with the same heart. In this she was ahead of her time, moved by the gospel. In an era and a society marked by profound inequalities, Rose's charity was almost revolutionary. That a young woman from Lima should welcome and serve indigenous people and enslaved people with her own hands, treating them as brothers and sisters and as living images of Christ, was a luminous testimony to the gospel. In this way, Rose showed through her actions that before God there are neither races nor categories, but only children who are equally loved. In every person in need, Rose saw and served Jesus himself. Another of her sayings expresses this simply: when we serve the poor and the sick, we serve Jesus. She lived out the Lord's words literally. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Matthew 25:40. Her charity toward the poor was, at heart, love for Christ hidden in them. Thus Rose, as a good daughter of Saint Dominic, united contemplation and action, prayer and charity. From prayer she drew the love that she then poured out upon the poor, and in the poor she found the Christ whom she contemplated in prayer. But to give herself in this way, she needed a place and time for intimacy with God. That place was a small hermitage she built in the garden of her home. Let us enter it. Chapter 6. The Garden Hermitage, Prayer and Even the Mosquitoes. In order to devote herself to prayer in solitude, Saint Rose built, with her own hands, a small hermitage or hut in a corner of the garden of her home. It was a humble, cramped place, set apart from the bustle of life, where she could withdraw alone with God. There she spent long hours in prayer, contemplation, and penance, in intimate and continual communion with the Lord. That garden hermitage was the hidden heart of her life. In that retreat, Rose lived a profound interior life. She contemplated the mysteries of Christ, meditated on his passion, worshipped God present in her soul, and enjoyed such intimacy with the Lord that it shone through in her face and her peace. Like Mary of Bethany, she had chosen the better part, Luke 10:42, to sit at the Lord's feet, listen to him, and love him. From that hidden spring, all her charity would later flow. That garden and hermitage are linked to one of the most endearing curiosities of her life, the tradition of the mosquitoes. It is said that the garden, with its plants and dampness, would fill with mosquitoes that might disturb the saint during her prayers. And the tradition, lovingly preserved by the writers of her homeland, says that Rose made a kind of pact with them. She would not harm them, and they would not bother her. The tradition adds, with delicate tenderness, that those mosquitoes honored the pact and even seemed to accompany Rose in her praises, joining their buzzing to the prayers with which she blessed God. It is a pious and enchanting tale, more legend than history, but it contains a beautiful truth, that of a soul so filled with God that even the smallest creatures seem to be reconciled with her and to praise the Creator alongside her. The scene recalls other saints, such as Saint Francis of Assisi, around whom a similar tradition of harmony with creatures also took root. For sin broke the peace between humanity and creation, and in the saints, reconciled with God, we glimpse something of that original peace of paradise when all creatures praised their Creator together. At heart, the tradition of Saint Rose of Lima's mosquitoes is a hymn to the holiness that brings all things into harmony. That hidden life of prayer and love, however, did not remain without visible fruits. God wished to glorify his servant through gifts and wonders, and through her he worked marvels that astonished all of Lima. Among them, the most famous is the occasion when Rose, through her prayer, helped defend the city from a great threat. Let us learn about the miracles and wonders of Saint Rose of Lima. Chapter 7. Miracles and Wonders. The Saint who defended Lima. The life of Saint Rose of Lima was surrounded by gifts and wonders through which God wished to glorify his humble servant. She is credited with healing the sick and with possessing a profound grace for consoling and healing souls. It is said that in order to heal the sick, she would show them an image of the child Jesus, whom she tenderly called my doctor or my little doctor, and pray beside them, often obtaining their relief and recovery. That image of the child Jesus, whom she affectionately called her little doctor, reveals the delicacy of her faith. Rose did not trust in her own power, but in Christ's, and attributed every healing and every good to him. She did not seek to amaze anyone with wonders, but to relieve those who suffered and lead them to God. The miracles the Lord worked through her were, to her, his work, not Rose's, and she always regarded herself as a humble servant. But the most famous episode, and the one that has most deeply marked the memory of her city, is the defense of Lima. In 1615, a fleet of pirates commanded by a foreign privateer threatened the coasts of Peru and spread terror throughout Lima, which feared being attacked and plundered. In that hour of danger, while the city trembled, Rose gave an unforgettable testimony of faith and courage. Tradition tells us that Rose ran to the church of Santo Domingo, where the Blessed Sacrament was kept, and gathered other women there, determined to defend the altar and the Eucharist with her own life against the invaders. She did not fear death. She feared only that Christ, present in the sacrament, might be desecrated. Together with the others, she devoted herself to prayer, offering to die rather than allow such an outrage. And it happened that the feared attack never took place. The threat faded, and the city was spared plunder. The people of Lima attributed their salvation to the prayers and courage of Rose and all those who accompanied her, seeing in it a grace from heaven obtained through her intercession. From then on, Rosa remained in the memory of her homeland as the saint who, through the sole power of prayer and love, helped defend her city. That episode reveals Rosa's heart, her ardent faith in the Eucharist, her courage, and her love for Christ above her own life. She who was physically frail, worn down by penance, proved stronger than warriors, because her strength was not human, but came from God. In her, it was fulfilled that God chooses the weak things of the world to confound the strong. Tradition also preserved other beautiful stories surrounding her, such as the one that, at her death, the city of Lima was filled with the fragrance of roses. Whether history or pious legend, all these accounts express the reputation for holiness that surrounded Rosa, and the love with which her people venerated her. But beyond the miracles, the heart of her life lay in her love for God, nourished by the Eucharist, the Virgin, and the Rosary. Let us look at this. Chapter 8. Devotion to the Eucharist, Mary, and the Rosary. At the center of Saint Rose's life was her love for the Eucharist. She adored Jesus, present in the Blessed Sacrament, with the deepest faith, and nourished herself on Holy Communion as on the bread of her soul. From that Eucharistic faith sprang, as we have seen, her courage in defending Lima. She preferred to die rather than see the sacrament of the altar profaned. The Eucharist was her strength, her joy, and her treasure. As a devoted daughter of St. Dominic, Rose also tenderly loved the Blessed Virgin Mary, whose name she had added to her own, calling herself Rose of St. Mary. She honored her as mother and queen, placed herself under her protection, and imitated her virtues. And she lovingly prayed the Holy Rosary, the prayer so dear to the Dominican family, in which she contemplated the mysteries of Christ by the hand of his mother. She also had a tender devotion to the child Jesus, whom she loved with the simplicity of a child's heart and a bride's heart. She kept an image of the child Jesus, with whom she interacted familiarly and tenderly, and whom, as we have said, she called her doctor when caring for the sick. In this devotion, we see the delicacy and tenderness of her love for Christ, which united the depths of contemplation with the simplicity of affection. And alongside the child Jesus, she loved Christ, crucified above all. The Lord's passion was the constant subject of her meditation, and before it she melted with love and gratitude. She contemplated Jesus' wounds, his sufferings, and his self-gift in love, and from that contemplation she drew strength for her own penance and charity. Everything in her led to the cross, and everything flowed from the cross. For Rose, these devotions were not empty practices, but expressions of a living and ardent love. The Eucharist, the Virgin, the Rosary, the child Jesus, the Passion, everything drew her closer to Christ and filled her with his love. And from that union with God sprang her peace, joy, and strength, which astonished all who met her. Rose was a woman profoundly happy in God, even amid a life of penance, and yet that happiness did not spare her from interior trials. Like all the great saints, Rose also knew the dark nights of the soul, dryness, temptations, and spiritual battles. Contemplating this aspect of her life makes her seem closer and more consoling to us, for it shows that the saints also struggle. Let us consider it with reverence. Chapter 9. The Soul's Struggles and Graces. The interior life of Saint Rose was not a smooth and easy path. She too endured severe trials. Like so many saints, Rose passed through long periods of dryness when she felt God's absence and darkness in her soul. She suffered temptations, anguish, and spiritual battles in which the enemy of salvation sought to discourage her and draw her away from God. She was no stranger to struggle or spiritual suffering. Those trials were perhaps even more painful than her bodily penances. To feel that God is hiding, to walk in the darkness of faith, to struggle against temptations and doubts. This is one of the heaviest crosses of the soul. Rose bore it with patience and perseverance, clinging to God by pure faith, even when she could not feel his consolation. In that dark night, her love was purified and strengthened. It is consoling for us to know that the saints too underwent such trials. Sometimes we imagine that holiness is a life without struggles or darkness, but Rose's life teaches us otherwise. The saints are not those who have no battles, but those who persevere in the midst of them without giving up, trusting in God despite every difficulty. Rose encourages us not to become discouraged in our own interior trials, and after the night, God consoled her with his light. Times of deep peace and interior graces followed the periods of dryness, during which Rose rejoiced in God's closeness and in a joy that is not of this world. Those consolations were the reward for her faithfulness in trial, and they gave her strength to carry on. Thus, the cross and consolation, night and light, alternated in her soul. Throughout it all, Rose remained humble and obedient. She did not rely on herself or on her experiences, but submitted everything to the judgment of her confessors and spiritual directors, seeking the security of the path through obedience. She knew that the enemy can deceive, and that humility and obedience are the soul's best defenses. That is why she always walked under the guidance of the Church, with simplicity and docility. Consumed by penance, labor, and struggles, as well as by illness, Rose spent her life out of love for Christ. Her body, always frail, grew weaker, and the saint, still young, drew near to the end of her pilgrimage. Let us contemplate her holy death and the mourning and veneration with which Lima bade her farewell, eventually making her its greatest treasure. Chapter 10. Death and Relics. Lima, the city of saints, consumed by penance and illness, Saint Rose died in Lima in 1617, when she was only 31 years old. Despite her youth, she left behind a life full of love, penance, and charity, and a reputation for holiness that had crossed the walls of her home and filled the entire city. She died as she had lived, united to Christ and abandoned into the hands of God. Her death was an event for all of Lima. The entire city came to bid her farewell, and her funeral became a great expression of popular devotion. Everyone wanted to see the saint, touch her, and entrust themselves to her. So great was the fervor of the faithful that, according to tradition, her body had to be buried several times because people eager to have a relic tried to take pieces of her clothing and strands of her hair. The people had proclaimed her a saint before the church did. Her remains rest in Lima, in the convent and basilica of Santo Domingo, the home of the Dominican order to which she had belonged as a tertiary. Her relics are venerated there, and pilgrims from all over the world come to honor her and ask for her intercession. Each year, her city honors her with grand celebrations and processions, during which all of Lima pours out its love for its saint. And there is something astonishing about that convent of Santo Domingo. Alongside Saint Rose, it is also the resting place of two other great saints of Lima, Saint Martin de Porres and Saint John Macias, both Dominicans and her contemporaries. For Lima at that time was a true city of saints. Within a few years and in a single city, several saints flourished, some of whom knew one another or could have known one another, and today they are venerated by the whole church. Indeed, Rose was a contemporary of Saint Martin de Porres, the humble Dominican brother filled with charity, and of Saint John Macias, and as a child she had been confirmed by Saint Turribius of Mogrovejo, the holy Archbishop of Lima. Several saints then lived in the same city and at the same time, as though God had wished to pour out a special abundance of grace and holiness upon that young Christianity of the New World. It is beautiful to imagine 17th century Lima, whose streets were walked at the same time by several saints, the young Rose tending her flowers, the humble Martin de Porres serving the sick and the poor, John Macias, porter of his convent, and shortly before them the holy Archbishop Turribius. Traveling throughout his diocese, God had wished to sow in that young Christianity an abundance of holiness that still amazes and encourages us today. Rose's holiness, recognized by the people from the very beginning, was to be solemnly confirmed by the Church just a few decades later, and that recognition would have immense significance, for it would make Rose the first saint of an entire continent. Let us look at her canonization, her patronage, and the beautiful well that still receives the wishes of the faithful today. Chapter 11. First Saint of the Americas, Canonization and the Wishing Well. Rose's reputation for holiness, already immense during her lifetime, and confirmed by miracles, moved the Church to examine her cause. And just a few decades after her death, Pope Clement VI solemnly canonized her in 1671, enrolling her in the catalogue of the saints. In this way, Rose of Lima became the first person born in the Americas to be raised to the altars, the first saint of the New World. It was an event of enormous significance for the whole Church, and in a special way for the lands of the Americas. Those young Christian communities, which had received the gospel barely more than a century earlier, now saw one of their own daughters proclaimed a saint by the universal Church. Rose was living proof that holiness had also taken root in the New World, and that God's grace knows neither borders nor races. The Church proclaimed her patroness of Peru, the city of Lima, all the Americas and the Philippines, as well as patroness of many other causes and places. She has been called the first flower of holiness in the Americas, and her name is honored throughout the continent. In countless cities, towns, churches, and people, the name of Rose of Lima resounds today, in remembrance of that humble young woman who became so great. That canonization was also a sign of hope for all peoples young in the faith. It showed that holiness is not the privilege of lands with an ancient Christian tradition, but a gift offered to all who welcome the gospel. Since Rose, the Americas have given the Church countless saints, but she was the first flower in a garden that has never ceased to bloom. In Lima, the shrine of Saint Rose is preserved as a treasure, built over the house where she lived, with its garden and the place of her hermitage. There one finds one of the spots most cherished by the faithful, the so-called wishing well. Tradition has it that in that well, which supplied the family with water, Rose threw the key to the padlock with which she had fastened, as a penance, an iron belt around herself, so that she would never be able to remove it. Since then, that well has become a beloved place of devotion. The faithful come to it and place letters and slips of paper there containing their petitions and intentions, entrusting them to the intercession of Saint Rose. It is a beautiful and faith-filled custom in which ordinary people place their wishes and needs in the saint's hands, confident of her protection. That well continues to receive, century after century, the prayers of those who place their trust in Rose. We too, as we contemplate the life of Saint Rose, can entrust our intentions to her, like someone dropping a letter into her well. But beyond devotions and traditions, Rose's life leaves us with precious lessons for our own time. Let us gather them before we finish, so that their memory may also be a light for our journey. Chapter 12. Lessons for today. The life of Saint Rose of Lima holds very valuable lessons for us. The first is that holiness can flourish anywhere and under any circumstances. Rose was neither a queen nor a foundress, and she never left her city. She was a humble young laywoman who became holy in her own home through work, prayer, and charity. Her example reminds us that everyone, whatever our way of life, is called to holiness wherever God has placed us. She also teaches us love for Christ and his cross. Outside the cross, there is no other ladder by which to climb to heaven, she would say. In a world that flees sacrifice and seeks only comfort, Rose reminds us that there is no true love without self-giving, nor glory without the cross. This does not mean imitating the severity of her penances, which belong to her time, but learning from her to embrace, out of love, the crosses of each day, united with those of Christ. In a way that is especially relevant today, she teaches us love for the poor and for those who suffer. Rose welcomed the sick, the elderly, indigenous people, and enslaved people into her home, seeing in everyone, without distinction, the face of Christ. When we serve the poor and the sick, we serve Jesus, she would say. Her example challenges us to open our hearts and hands to those in need, and not to treat people differently, because all are children of God. She also teaches us to unite prayer and action, contemplation and charity. Rose drew from prayer the love that she then poured out upon the poor, and in the poor she found the Christ whom she contemplated in prayer. She reminds us that charity without prayer withers, and prayer without charity becomes sterile, and that the Christian life must unite both, like the two faces of the same love. Finally, she teaches us to persevere in trials. Rose knew spiritual dryness, temptations, and battles of the soul, and overcame them through faith, humility, and perseverance. Her example comforts all who pass through dark nights, assuring them that God does not abandon his own, but that after trial, consolation always comes, and after the cross, glory. May Saint Rose of Lima, the first flower of holiness in the Americas, obtain for us an ardent love for Christ, a charitable heart toward the poor, and the strength to persevere on the way of the cross. And may she intercede for us, for our families, and for the entire continent that venerates her as its first saint. Let us place ourselves under her protection with a trusting prayer, entrusting to her, as to the well of her wishes, our petitions. Chapter 13. Prayer to Saint Rose of Lima. Glorious Saint Rose of Lima, first flower of holiness in the Americas, who from childhood consecrated yourself to Christ and loved him with all your heart. Obtain for me an ardent love for the Lord, so that I may make him the center of my life and deny him nothing out of love. You who embraced the cross with joy and taught that outside the cross there is no other ladder by which to climb to heaven, teach me to carry my crosses each day united with those of Christ, knowing that through them we reach glory. You who welcomed the poor and the sick into your home and saw in them the face of Jesus, obtain for me a charitable and generous heart, that I may know how to serve Christ in those who suffer without treating anyone differently. You who persevered in faith through the trials of the soul and were consoled by God after the night, sustain my hope in dark hours and help me always to trust in the Lord, who never abandons his own. To you, Saint Rose, I entrust my petitions, like the letters that the faithful cast into your well. Present your intention here. Present them to your spouse, Jesus Christ, and obtain for me, if it is for my good, the grace I ask of you, and above all, the grace to love God and be saved. Saint Rose of Lima, first saint of the Americas, pray for me, for my family, and for all who turn to you, so that, following your example, one day we may come to contemplate God with you in heaven. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Saint Rose of Lima, the first flower of holiness of the New World, pray for us.